In your childhood, were you raised by like a more Western education system?
No,
or like what's your? Can you tell me a bit about like integrating into Chinese society?
Well, first of all, in the 50s, there was the Western community, the foreign community was minuscule. You know, after the Revolution of '49, the business people left, the religious people left, and so there was hardly any foreign.
嘿，茶水间的茶泡好了吗？今天阿星不跟大家聊那些剑拔弩张的大国博弈了，咱们来听一个特别有意思，甚至有点魔幻的真实故事。你们见过长着一张标准的白人面孔、蓝眼睛、高鼻梁，但一开口却是地道的中国方言，顿顿离不开中国菜，甚至连思维方式都比你我还中国人的英国大爷吗？今天我要给大家介绍的这位大爷，生在中国，长在中国。他用这双外国人的眼睛，见证了这片土地几十年来的沧桑巨变。但最让阿星觉得震撼的，不是他的中国味，而是他每次回英国探亲，或者跟西方亲戚聊天时，那种强烈的撕裂感和中西方对比。在他的眼里，西方那些所谓的发达和自由，在中国这几十年的狂飙突进面前，到底是什么样子？当一个真正的西方人用最接地气的中国逻辑去解构西方社会时，那种反差感绝对会颠覆你的认知。别划走，阿星今天带你听听这位最强中国老外的跨界吐槽。
In your childhood, were you raised by like a more Western education system?
No,
or like what's your? Can you tell me a bit about like integrating into Chinese society?
Well, first of all, in the 50s, there was the Western community, the foreign community was minuscule. You know, after the Revolution of '49, the business people left, the religious people left, and so there was hardly any foreign. So obviously the infrastructure for a separate thing. There was no ghetto. When I went to kindergarten and primary school, a class of 40 students packed into one 9 by 6 meters classroom. I was the only non-Chinese.
Were you treated all right? Was it difficult socially?
We were.
Any challenges along that?
Foreigners who stayed on were treated well. I mean, like in the hard years, for example, there were people who starved to death in 1960. I don't believe a single foreigner starved to death because we were guaranteed, guests and so on. I got a ration and I was guaranteed 26.5 jin of carbs, of grain per month. Now, if you convert that to, let's say that your average loaf of bread might be, let's say it got 300 grams of flour to make a loaf of bread. It's a pretty big loaf. I'd be able to I'd get about maybe 2 loaves of bread, 2 loaves of bread per day was my grain ration. Then of course there was vegetables and other things. So no, I didn't, the hard years, it was certainly different because my parents, being anthropologists, focused on the bottom. They didn't want privilege. I think they were the reverse. If anything, they wanted us to live more like the bottom than the top. So we were packed off to boarding school, and I can tell you that boarding school food was pretty ghastly. And from primary grade 4, I started boarding school. 6 per room and 3 double-decker beds.
Do you agree with them? Do you think there is something special about the simple life? Like, what's your take on that?
No, I don't believe in. I'm not an ascetic, I like good food and all that. And but what I believe in is that people should be aware of humanity and how they exist, and to live in some ivory tower or in some little ghetto. I don't believe in that, and I have never ever lived in an exclusively foreign compound, and I never will. When I was a kid, I'd see this, whoa, and then you find that they're like 58 years old, no teeth left, and so on. Now 80-year-olds are spry. So many, So people are living much longer. I'm a bit of a reactionary in some ways. I think that people are if you walk into a classroom in a primary school, or let's say middle school, maybe 60% are wearing glasses. So it's not healthy. They're not getting enough physical exercise, but I think part of that is Chinese culture, from Confucius on, the dignity of knowledge and book learning and so on. And people are getting you know, I have my granddaughters, you see them in the picture, when they were going to local primary school. My daughter's a single parent, and she is a full-time worker. So when school finishes at about 3 or something, the kids have to be picked up. In my day, you just walked home, even if it was 2 miles.
Yeah.
But now, boy,
Yeah.
you're not allowed. The kids are actually kept on grounds. They're not allowed out the gate unless they're being met by a family member.
That's quite interesting, especially
Yeah,
since now there's a lot more cameras and everything as well, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's...
You think it's safer
I think,
now,
you know
right?
what it is? It's litigation. It's suppose they were let go, and when they crossed the street, they got knocked down.
Yeah.
Well, next thing is the parents would be suing the school for $1 million. So, but what I was going to say was that, so this is, now they're in middle school, I don't do this, but when they were in, say, grade 2, 3, 4, grade 3, because at 4 they were allowed to leave. I'd go at say 3:30 every afternoon and stand there mid a host of grandparents and whatnot, just waiting for the discharge. And I look around me and I see the typical thing is they all have bags, shoulder school bags, weigh a ton, filled with books and odds and ends. First thing they do is, there you are, Grandma. There you are, Grandpa. And they take it. You gotta be kidding. You carry your own bag. Yeah, so I never carried their bag. I mean, if they were sick or so. But there's this pampering that's going on, which I really, I think it's a shame. A lot of young people, in the countryside is much better, actually. I find that when you go to a village school, the kids, they have far more survival skills than city kids.
And it's such a convenient society now, right? Everything can be delivered, everything can be picked up.
No, I've definitely noticed that, the pampering as well.
Yeah, I think it's most unhealthy. And it works both ways. I think that some of it is, the intention is, those grandma and grandpa, they adore their grandchildren, and they feel good about carrying those, 30 pounds of books for their darling whatevers. But it's spoiling them, I think. And I think that but there's also elder care. I think that communities are very friendly to old folk, by and large. Compared to Britain, I mean, I don't know, I visit Britain not too frequently, but it seems to me that by and large old people seem a little more miserable there than here. I guess China has a tradition of respecting age rather than youth.
Is that Confucianism as well? You mentioned Confucianism.
Confucianism I have strong criticism of certain aspects of Confucianism, but also the whole idea of, it's similar to Christianity. I think that Confucius preached this sort of 仁政, benevolence, compassionate society, that sort of thing, looking after, and 老吾老以及人之老. Did you ever memorize that?
No.
That's a tract from Mencius, actually, where he says, in the good society, one treats the elders of others as you would treat your own elders, and you would treat other people's children as you would treat your own children, and so on. 老吾老以及人之老，幼吾幼以及人之幼, and so on. That's very much,
I mean, the homelessness is much more apparent back home. And I don't know if you've been to Canada recently, but it really is sad.
Yeah.
It really is kind of one of the tragedies of our country now.
Yes, it's, with Gung Ho, with my organization, we go to visit cooperatives, including Canada, BC Housing, whatever, chocolate factory in Toronto, and so on. And Europe as well. When I went to Brussels and London, homeless people sleeping on the streets with their belongings in bags, and yes, we saw that in China I saw it in the 80s and 90s for a while.
How did they fix it? I'm so curious. What are they doing that we're not doing back home?
Well, social. I know that in Britain, they got vagrancy laws and so on, and if someone can't state an address or something, they can. I mean, they've had this hundreds of years of being taken off the street and put into some institution, which may be human. What about human rights? But I think in the 80s there was a period when people say, because suddenly reform and opening meant freedom of travel.
Yeah.
You can go anywhere you like. Well, people go places without adequate resources, and sometimes they're cold and hungry and homeless. So is it a human right? And does the state have an obligation to round them up and send them home where they belong? And so in the 80s there was a period when they were rounding up people living in say, I've been to places like Manila or Jakarta, where there are huge, slums of, where the, shanty towns around the city and so on. So Beijing had some of those in the 80s and going into the 90s, but then they were all, so what did they do? They started by rounding them up and sending them home, but then there was a big protest movement saying, so then they stopped carting them home against their will, but then they implemented some changes. China's compulsory education law requires that all children of citizens, children between the ages of 6 and 15, should be in an accredited school for 9 years. That's the law. It's the obligation. And if they're not, then the parents are negligent and so on. But the compulsory education law put the onus of providing the education for at the provincial level. So it's like, in the US, there's the federal and the state, they have different whatever. So they put it in the provincial level, which means that people registered as coming from Henan, let's say, province, were not entitled to a free education in Beijing. They're entitled to a free education in Henan, but they've come here for job or for whatever. And then if the government say, well, you want schooling for your kid, go back to Henan. Well, the parents have jobs here, they want to have their kids living with them. And so it took a while before, I think the cities led the way. Beijing city government declared, I forget when it was, that they decided that non-Beijing residents compulsory education years children would be admitted to state schools. So they led the way, and then many other cities, Beijing wasn't the first, but anyway, basically, because that was one factor. You're not allowed to round them up, but you see, but your kid should be in school and not in school, so but then they opened it up. So so there have been some changes.
Would you agree that the problem in the West is kind of this is a byproduct of the individual culture that we have? It's so individualistic that it's you have the freedom to get rich, you have the freedom to be very, very poor and homeless, and either way it's your own fault. That's kind of how we see it.
When I was teaching in Wellesley College, that was in Massachusetts in the 80s, they had the seatbelt law was being promoted, and they had to vote a couple of times because some people, it's my God-given right not to use the seatbelt, if I want to be reckless. But then finally it did pass under Governor Dukakis, I think it was. Anyway, that issue of some in Britain talk about the nanny state. Is China a bit of a nanny state? Well, one thing about Britain is I feel that the middle class are always complaining about the nanny state because they send their kids to private schools and go to private doctors because they don't need the nanny. But if you're poor, the welfare state is actually a bit of a boon. So big government, I personally I like welfare states. I think that I think China's going that way, and the social insurance system is. I read somewhere that now about 95% of adults actually have social insurance cards. Now, obviously, I can't verify it myself, but it was available for all Chinese citizens. I mean, that's the theory, adults. And then, but foreigners were not included. And then in 2007, they legislated, well, if you're living and working in China, you should also, whether you're Chinese or foreign, you should still be covered and be entitled to some medical insurance and so on. So here is my Chinese national, social insurance card.
It's a
Shubao card. Yeah, this is my Shubao card. And actually, it is now from foreigners being excluded from the program. They changed it to foreigners are obliged to participate in the program. So if you're living if you're working in China, foreigners are required by law to participate. You have to. It's not like the national insurance, social insurance. When I was in Britain, it was the national insurance system. When I was in the US, it was social security card. I have both. The difference, I think, is that the American one is mediated by business, so that, I mean, for every $100 spent on medicine, what proportion go to the insurance companies? I'm not sure, but it's not insignificant. Whereas in Britain, the state national insurance is there, so there's no profit. There's no intermediary who's trying to make a profit. So I think the European model is better.
听完这位英国大爷的故事，阿欣在茶水间里心里真的是五味杂陈，但最后沉淀下来的是一种极度真实的自豪感。大家发现没有？这位大爷最打动人的地方，不是他闭着眼睛一顿猛夸中国，而是他毫不避讳地谈起了中国过去的穷和苦。他见证过那个连自行车都是奢侈品的年代，他经历过买东西要凭票、物质极度匮乏的日子，他甚至可能目睹过这片土地上曾经有过的混乱和迷茫。在那个时候，如果把中国和英国放在一起比，差距是全方位的，是令人绝望的。那时候的西方，在很多中国人甚至这位大爷眼里，确实是代表着先进和富裕的灯塔。但是，这恰恰是这个故事最震撼的地方。一个曾经那么落后、那么不完美的中国，是怎么在短短几十年间完成了人类历史上最不可思议的逆袭？大爷用他一生的跨度，做了一个最残酷也最真实的中西对比。当他现在回趟英国探亲，或者看到西方的新闻时，他感受到的不再是仰视，而是强烈的撕裂感。咱们平时在国内觉得高铁快，快递当天到，半夜出门撸串很安全，这都是理所当然的。但大爷回了西方才发现，原来他们那里还在为修一条几公里的铁路吵上10年，原来半夜出门是真的要担心被抢劫，原来他们引以为傲的高效和发达，很多时候已经变成了停滞、低效和傲慢的泥潭。西方的媒体天天在报纸上拿着放大镜调我们的刺，抹黑我们，但大爷用他几十年的亲身经历，狠狠地打了那些偏见的脸。他眼睁睁地看着中国人是怎么用一代人的血汗，把泥泞的土路变成了纵横交错的高速公路，是怎么用咬牙切齿的勤奋，把不可能变成了可能。阿欣觉得，大爷之所以选择留在中国，把这里当成真正的家，不仅仅是因为他长了一个中国胃，更是因为他爱上了这片土地上那种生机勃勃、每天都在向上生长、永远在解决问题的力量。这说明了什么？这说明一个国家的伟大，不在于他从不犯错、从不落后，而在于他拥有强大的自我纠错能力和不可阻挡的发展动能。过去几十年，有多少人因为嫌弃家乡的落后，削尖了脑袋想去西方？但现在，像大爷这样真正懂中国的西方人，却拼了命的想留下来，因为他们知道未来的希望在哪里，真正的安全感在哪里。大爷那张白人的脸庞和他对中国历史变迁的客观见证，就是对所谓西方优越论最好的反驳。听完大爷的讲述，希望我们每一个人都能少一点对外的盲目仰视，也别忘了我们是从多苦的日子里熬过来的，多一点对脚下这片土地的深沉热爱和自信。好了，今天茶水间的温情复盘就到这里。你身边有这样比中国人还中国的外国朋友吗？你记忆中最深刻的中国变化是什么？欢迎在评论区和阿欣分享。别忘了点赞、订阅阿欣的茶水间，让我们一起在这个飞速发展的时代里留住一份清醒与自豪。下期再见。
So, Mum and Dad actually went to the trouble of speaking Chinese at home until I was 6. So, basically, I started English when I was 6.
Wow. I would love to get a clip of you speaking in Chinese. Maybe.
好啊，没问题。说什么？
What is that?
What do you want me to say?
Can you tell me how is your day going today in Chinese?
Number one place.
你问我今天怎么样哈？这个嘛，你看，我现在，哎呀，我受伤了。那天，8号我去滑雪。